Hello and welcome to the training, Maximizing Opportunities for Student Success, the Innovation Implementation Cycle. While this training is specifically targeted to school community councils, the ideas contained in this training apply to implementation of innovations in a variety of settings. Your trainers for these sessions are education specialists Rebecca Peterson and Lisa McLachlan from the Utah State Board of Education. We hope that you will find this training informative, useful, but ultimately we hope that this training can help your school community council to amplify the likelihood of student success by leveraging the power of the science of successful innovation implementation through application of the innovation implementation cycle. This training is based on ideas rooted in implementation science, or the investigation of the factors and processes that are associated with innovative lasting changes. Implementation science is one approach that educational researchers, schools, and stakeholder partnerships are using to improve the likelihood that interventions will succeed. Implementation science is different from other approaches to improvement because of its focus on identifying local factors or variables that can disrupt or hamper successful school change. The purpose of this training is to familiarize school community council members, including parents, teachers, administrators, or other participants, with the innovation implementation cycle, and to provide tools and information that you can use as you work through the process of implementing the cycle from year to year. This training will consist of 5 parts and will take approximately 90 minutes to 2 hours to complete. This component is the introduction. The next component is identify needs. The third component is plan and implement. The fourth is monitor and assess. And the fifth is analyze and understand. We recommend viewing all training segments and then discussing the ideas and planning for implementation of the innovation implementation cycle as a school community council. The segments can be viewed one at a time or all in one sitting. As with all new ideas, implementation will likely not be perfect, but the important part is to begin together as a unified team who has the ability to impact student outcomes, and to be willing to learn, monitor, discuss, and adjust as you go. As I considered how to introduce this material, a few thoughts came to my mind. All of the following short quotations are relevant to school community councils. As we work together to improve the educational outcomes for all students, these quotations can serve as food for thought. Looking at this first quotation, which is an African proverb, if you want to go quickly, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. This particular quotation can help you as you focus on working together as a team on this journey. The second one from Jeffrey Canada, who's an educational author and an educator himself, says, build an organization that can tackle the tough things and keep moving. So one of the things that we interact with often within our school settings are tough things. They're hard problems. But when you have an effective team, an effective organization, this allows you to continue to refine and build your organization into one that has that resilience and the clarity that are necessary to tackle those tough things. The third quote is one from Stephen Covey. He talks about keeping the main thing is to keep the main thing the main thing. This is a good reminder just to stay focused and keep whatever is most important front and center. There are a lot of competing things for our attention, and sometimes we find other pet projects or things that can be distracting, and this is a good reminder to keep things focused. The fourth quote is from Karen Blasey, who is the researcher from the University of North Carolina, and her focus is on the science of implementation. And while this quotation seems like it's kind of obvious, sometimes we don't think about it. You know, we invest in programs and things, but do our kids actually get those programs? So the quotation from her is, "Students cannot benefit from instructional practices and interventions they do not receive." So the teams that we have and the way we implement things will allow that successful implementation. And when those things happen, when they're implemented with fidelity, when they're monitored, when they're discussed, when we make adjustments, those things lead to significant impacts on student outcomes. The rest of this introduction will address some basic concepts related to creating a collaborative team culture between parents and educators as members of a school community council. It will also provide an overview of the innovation cycle, which will be the main focus of this training. The best time to plant a tree is 20 years ago. The second best time is today. This is a quotation from the book The Speed of Trust, written by Stephen M.R. Covey. These are some components of effective community council teams, or just effective teams in general. So summarized from the research literature, these are 4 areas that teams can focus on. So how do we create those collaborative teams between administrators and parents? Before we dive into the innovation implementation cycle, we feel that it's important to share some basic information and ideas about effective teams. We will go into some detail, but not a tremendous amount of detail on these items because this isn't the focus of these particular training modules. However, it should be fairly clear that effective teams are the foundation that must be present in order for the rest of the items in the innovation implementation cycle to be successful. If your team is either not well defined or has issues surrounding trust, communication, or accountability, I recommend that you start your focus here on building and defining an effective team before moving on to the innovation implementation cycle. The following are some basic ideas that come from research on characteristics and practices of effective teams. As we go through these items, you may want to ask yourself, or pause the presentation and ask your team, can I identify these items with regards to my school community council team? Is my understanding aligned with the ideas and understanding of other members of my team? If you do not know the answers to either of those questions as you go through these characteristics of effective teams, take some time to discuss, define, clarify, and establish a collective understanding of these items as they relate to your school community council. Clarity of purpose. Can you define what your team's purpose is? What is the vision and mission for your team? Do you understand the relationship of your school community council to the purpose and mission of the school? A quick note about common vocabulary. Education is known for their proclivity for inventing and adopting acronyms of all kinds, and for jargon. As educators, we use these words and terms so frequently that many times we forget that the terms are not words or ideas that are commonly used outside of our professional work. Are there terms or vocabulary that you're not sure about? Does the team have a common vocabulary with which to discuss the work that you're engaging in? You may want to consider keeping a post-it note of terms that need to be clarified or defined to review as a team. Accountability tends to have a negative connotation. Many times, members are uncomfortable with discussions related to accountability due to perceived power structures, concern about how another person will take feedback related to accountability, or people tend to avoid these situations just because they're not sure how to approach them. Think about meetings, not necessarily your school community council meetings, when the meeting has been derailed because of either a lack of expected norms for meeting behavior, or because someone violated the expected norms, or because someone didn't complete a task or a responsibility that needed to be done. What kind of trust tends to exist in those situations? Establishing clear norms and expectations and establishing a way to remind people of the expectations can help avoid uncomfortable issues surrounding accountability. Work as a team to establish your norms. What's important for your team's functioning? Is it sticking to an agenda, being on time, equal opportunities to share ideas, not shooting down or criticizing ideas? How will you address those things if or when they occur? For example, one team I was on had someone who liked to monopolize the conversation. By putting the norm out on the table that everyone's voice was important, we established a process with a key phrase that we could use to redirect conversation when necessary. Let's take a moment to hear some other ideas was our key phrase. Because this was laid out ahead of time and it was a value that was important to our team, when we used this phrase, the team member was not offended because we had established this as an important part of our communication and work prior to the occurrence. Another note with norms, it is helpful to only have 3 or 4, so pick the most important and then review them at the start of each meeting. Let's think about responsibilities. How will you keep track of and follow up on who will do what by when, and how will we know? Do you have a common understanding for what this vocabulary about accountability contains and looks like for your school community council? What will you do if, and more likely when, something gets dropped? How will you address it? Will this be preemptive? Do you have after the fact? Put these expectations on the table ahead of time. Perhaps saying something like, just a quick reminder, or something like, from our meeting minutes, I see that you agreed to do blah, blah, blah. Do you need any help with meeting the deadline? Or, this is what I'm seeing. Maybe forgot, didn't do. Can you help me to understand what's actually happening? Defining those terms and phrases ahead of time will help you to avoid potential misunderstandings, hurt feelings, and it will help to build trust. Team roles are important for effective teams. In a team, it is important to understand that for everybody, the roles, so make sure they understand the roles of each person. Some teams rotate roles, some keep them the same from time to time. Some roles are flexible, like the minutes taker or the timekeeper. Others, like the chairperson, president, team leader, may not be as flexible. One key thing is to define who is in charge of what and how those interactions take place. The school community council is not a place for power structures where any one group or person is in charge and everyone else just follows along. Leadership is not about being the boss, it is about facilitating the success of the team. What are the roles of the members of your team? Are there areas that you need to discuss relating to any perceived imbalances in power of members of your team? Quick note, imbalances of power are not necessarily assigned to or related to assigned roles like administrator, parent, teacher, etc. Roles by their nature will be different. Administrators have administrative responsibilities, teachers are implementing, parents are providing input, ideas, and discussion. All parties equally contribute, though their roles may be very different. Imbalances in power tend to occur in low trust environments where people perceive that a particular role equates to somebody being in charge and somebody else having to follow without input, or where the discussions about roles and leadership have never happened. There's a saying that whoever owns the data holds the power. As we will discuss later, data are extremely useful. Data tells a story about where we came from, where we are right now, and it will help us to map, navigate, and adjust our track as we move forward. The role of data within your team is important, so who's in charge of that role? Who's in charge of collecting and disseminating the information? Who interprets the data and finds the story that it tells? Does this happen with your whole team in a group review? Or maybe just a few members of the team put it together? Does the administrator bring this information with him or her? We'll talk more about data in the innovation implementation cycle, but for now, just keep the role of data person or data people in mind as an important component of an effective team. Clear procedures and processes include things like defining when and where meetings occur, how process how meeting minutes are distributed, and like we talked about previously, they help you to define the ideas that will address who does what by when and how will we know. The last component of effective teams is trust. From Stephen M.R. Covey's book, The Speed of Trust, The One Thing That Changes Everything, he makes a few key points that are relevant to these ideas. He says, there is one thing that is common to every individual, relationship, team, family, organization, nation, economy, and civilization throughout the world. The one thing which, if removed, will destroy the most powerful government, the most successful business, the most thriving economy, the most influential leadership, the greatest friendship, the strongest character, the deepest love. On the other hand, if developed and leveraged, that one thing has the potential to create unparalleled success and prosperity in every dimension of life. Yet it is the least understood, most neglected, and most underestimated possibility of our time. That one thing is trust. He goes on to describe, in a high trust relationship, you can say the wrong thing and people will still get your meaning. In a low trust relationship, you can be very measured, even precise, and they'll still misinterpret you. We judge ourselves by our intentions and others by their behavior. This is why one of the fastest ways to restore trust is to make and keep commitments, even very small commitments, to ourselves and others. So ask yourself as a team, what does a high trust team look like? What do we do? What don't we do? What constitutes a violation of trust, and how do those things get handled? If you'd like to review some of the ideas that we just covered in more detail, here are some resources that may be helpful. There's links to 2 articles about effective teams, the characteristics of effective teams. And here are some books that you can review or read. And these things are really helpful, especially when you're talking about successful team communication and action. The last item on this slide is a meeting agenda tool. And this is one that can be adapted as it's helpful for your team. It has built-in components that contribute to effective, action-focused meetings. If you'd like more time to review these resources, you may want to pause this presentation to get the information so that you can either write it down or take a screenshot or whatever before you continue. The rest of this training will focus on the innovation implementation cycle. The components of this cycle are identify needs, plan, implement, monitor and assess, analyze and understand. You will notice that there's not a starting point or an ending point. That's because this process is cyclical. Once you get it going, the idea is to keep it going, one cycle informing the next. This training will begin where you will initiate the cycle with identify needs. Thank you for your participation in this introduction and for investing in the success of your team, your school, and above all, for investing in the success of your students. This is the end of presentation 1, the introduction.